Hi everyone, I'm Scott Williamson. I'm the founder of Collective Euphonia, and I'm so happy to welcome you to this conversation about mental health and creativity.
I'm Ashera Capolero. I'm a singer on the program, and I'm also a music director and choir conductor and a teacher. I do all the things.
Hi everyone, I'm Bob Trestman, Chair of Psychiatry at the Virginia Tech Carilion School of Medicine and Carilion Clinic.
So we're here to have a conversation to pair with our program called Listening to Paintings, which members of our collective, which is a flexible interdisciplinary artist collective of singers, dancers, other musicians, and other artists from the theater. We recorded a program called Renewal and Healing, featuring music from across over 4 centuries of repertory dealing with those themes. Many of the artists suffered from depression and anxiety, even bipolar disorder themselves. Several died in asylums. And so today we're here to talk about these connections that we find across history. It's really interesting. In the Taubman, there on display is a 16th century tapestry from Flemish tapestry, and it depicts the opening of Homer's The Iliad, whose first line, incidentally, says, "Sing, muse, of the rage of Achilles." And depicted in the tapestry are all of these figures and all these scenes from ancient mythology, but also with contemporary resonances as well. And that's an excellent frame of reference for what we're talking about. So we know that as far as music having a therapeutic effect, references to the power of music go back to ancient sources like the Bible, David playing the harp for the melancholy and anxious and raging King Saul, Orpheus playing his either his harp or his lute to charm the animals and the trees. The connection also between music and nature and healing is something we'll talk about, something that was featured in our program. We find in the writings of Aristotle and other ancient philosophers connections between creativity, so-called genius, artistic genius, and so-called madness. And indeed, we can compare those ancient writings with the writings of Baroque poets like John Dryden, who is one of the poets featured in our program. Dryden is credited with the quote, "Great wits are to madness near allied, and thin partitions do their bounds divide." And that's, of course, archaic, high English language describing the fact that, the artistic temperament and the creative cycles are close together, and sometimes we can't really separate them out. And one of the things Bob is going to talk about is our understandings of these cycles and these illnesses and how we treat them now. One of the questions we ask when we have these conversations is, what might have the lives of some of these artists been if they had been in treatment, for example? And so the fact that music has been therapy, that dance, that the arts have been therapy across the centuries, used by the artists themselves to process their own experiences, also speaks to this connection. And then, of course, when we're talking about the arts and temperament and manic depressive illness, as one of the famous researchers, Kay Redfield Jamison, refers to in her book Touch with Fire, Manic Depressive Illness and the Artistic Temperament. There are so many case studies, and 2 of the most prominent ones would be featured in a program like ours at a museum. Schumann, Robert Schumann, 19th century German pianist and composer who suffered manic depressive illnesses all his life, attempted suicide, spent time in an asylum, died tragically after being institutionalized in his mid-50s. And then, of course, Vincent van Gogh, the painter who also attempted suicide and spent his final years in an even shorter life in an asylum. And they're artists whose creativity and cycles have been studied, and the source of many pieces like Redfield Jamison's. And one of the things she talks about is how hereditary these illnesses are, and that's another thing that we look forward to hearing from Bob. So I'm going to pause here and leave us with a thought here. A number of songs that we're doing are also from the 20th century. Asher's going to talk about one of her favorite songs, Sure on the Shining Night by Samuel Barber, which is from the 30s. And the 20s and the 30s were periods following World War I, following an incredible boom, and of course then a crash, but then another rise. So a period of incredible artistic renewal and creativity. And so some of the songs that we have are in direct response to those times. So how will we respond today? How do you respond to the cycles in your life? The four seasons and the four temperaments are another theme that with many historic references, and we have some prompts and some thoughts about how nature and the seasons and the cycles might be useful in your own self-care regimen. So I'm going to turn it over now to Bob, who's going to talk about mental health.
So there's a lot to discuss, and I'm not going to even be able to touch on most of it, but a few things to keep in mind. The majority of creative people are healthy. So it's important just to frame that from the very beginning. But there is this interesting dynamic between creativity and distress. There are genetics, and there's certainly the environment. And so, we do know that there are family risk factors, that people who come from families with a history of bipolar disorder or manic depression have a greater risk of having it. Those with a history of schizophrenia have a greater risk of it. Those with depression. And so we know that. But what does that really mean? These are risk factors. There's not a linear relationship. There are some genetic illnesses that are a single gene, and if you inherit that gene, you're going to get the illness. But most of what we're talking about in terms of psychiatric illnesses, that's not the case. It's a little bit more or a little bit less of risk. But in contrast to a formal diagnosis, either you have it or you don't, think more about creativity in parallel. You can have a little creativity, you have a lot of creativity. You can, in that same way, you can have a tendency to be more depressed or less depressed. You can have a tendency to have very, very stable moods year-round, whether the sun's out or not, or you can be very reactive to the light, to the environment, to isolation, to being with people. You can be tolerant of frustration in the service of creativity, or you may not be able to tolerate that level of frustration. You just want to get a project done, which may shut off opportunities for being creative. All of these are different dimensions. And so you can think about individuals on these different dimensions, that if you are able to tolerate the frustration that comes from trying to be creative, you may get more anxious. You may get more frustrated while you're doing that. You may become more irritable. You may get depressed while you are creating something that may take many failures to achieve something extraordinary, whether it's a visual art or a performance or auditory in song. And so there are many different pieces to it. But when we talk about mania, as opposed to just being having a lot of energy, we're talking about a distortion of reality, so much so that people are no longer able to distinguish what's really out there from what is an internal demon or a complete misinterpretation of the real world. That can get people hospitalized. It can cause them profound risk. It can lead to suicide, and frequently does. But when you think about what happens if you ratchet it back a little so that it's not that extreme, the boundaries between the concrete of what we see and the ephemeral of what we can imagine become less clear. We're able to synthesize things that aren't black and white. And so in that way, we push these boundaries. So if you go too far, you become crippled in your ability to function. But going closer breaks the boundaries that we are normally working hard to maintain. Much of our brain is designed to eliminate unwanted input. There is so much input. What we hear, what we see, what we smell, what we touch. 90% of what our brain does is filter all that out. That's mainly what the brain is doing, so we can focus. We can focus on finding food to survive, finding a mate to reproduce, the very core basic things of life. But we need to be creative to loosen those bounds of elimination and incorporate things. It's not that big a difference between, I see a cloud, and in that cloud, I can see beautiful shapes, and I can imagine. One more step is, I see an evil face in that cloud telling me I should do something that could harm someone else. It's all steps. It's all on a continuum. So it's a really fascinating opportunity to realize that we're all people. Each of us has our own internal demons. Sometimes we're better at managing them, sometimes not. But some of us have these gifts where we do get frustrated and we're able to channel that energy, tolerate that frustration, and create something that can become a gift to others. So that can reach a level that we would call depression or an anxiety disorder or bipolar disorder. But it may be less than that. The other thing that I just wanted to mention, you had mentioned folks like Van Gogh, who died, who had multiple suicide attempts, disfigured himself in a psychotic manic episode by removing his ear. There's always the balance. We're talking about treatment. We are getting better at treating illness without eliminating creativity. Mm-hmm. The goal of treatment is not to make everyone normal. We don't want to do that. What we want to do is allow each person to be as joyful as they can, as creative as they can, but have control over their own lives. Some mental illness takes away the control, and treatment, whether with psychotherapy and skills, whether through art therapy or music therapy, the therapies that give us a greater sense of self, or medications that may help to guide the brain so that we can choose to focus on some things and ignore others, that just gives us an ability. It's not easy, but it requires collaboration between the person who is suffering and the clinician who has spent years training to be able to help give people advice and guidance. But it has to be a pas de deux. It has to be a duet. It has to be a collaboration between the person receiving care and the person giving it. It's not me telling you what you should be doing, but offering you guidance as to how we can help you to lead a healthier life while you can still find the joy of creativity.
Yeah, thank you. That's such a beautiful summary. I'm also glad you talked about treatment at the end. I'm curious if not to put you on the spot, because we didn't talk about this, but I bet some folks would love to hear a succinct summary of what happens in the brain with patients who suffer from, say, bipolar disorder, and what different medications a treat. In, you know, if that's something you can easily summarize.
I really,
even,
well, it's of course a logical question, and if we knew more, I might have a simple answer. But as I think most of us know, when it's really complicated to explain, that's really because we really don't understand enough. So, bottom line, we do know that in people who are experiencing hallucinations, take it to the extreme, seeing things that aren't there, hearing voices telling them to do things, what we call command auditory hallucinations. If while they are experiencing that, we have them in a fancy imaging device like an MRI machine or something called a positron emission tomograph, a PET scanner, and we are, while they're thinking these things, scanning their brains to see what the activity is. The fascinating thing is the image looks just like they are actually hearing someone speak to them, or like they're actually seeing these things out in the real world. There's no way the brain can distinguish it. So these are real experiences. It's just that it's a misinterpretation because of the complexities of the brain. And the treatment really reinforces the purpose of what I mentioned before. The brain is, so much of it is designed to take the overwhelming amount of sensation that we have from the world and give our ability of the brain to narrow the perception, which is a very active process, down to something manageable. So the medications help to eliminate the excessive amount of information the brain is trying to manage. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. It does. It does. I know as some folks have questions about serotonin and those kinds of things. So since we're here, thank you.
Of course.
So one of the things that we wanted to talk about was the connection between creativity and nature, between moods and cycles and nature, and self-care therapies and strategies, right, Ashura?
Yeah, we were talking about one of the songs on the program that I sang. I think it's the second song in the program, and it's the Samuel Barber song that we were talking about from the 30s, I guess. And I can't remember the poet's name.
James Agee.
James Agee. So the poem particularly, I mean, obviously it's set very beautifully, but the poem is, I guess, an impressionist point of view from the speaker, who's essentially communing with nature at night. But it vaguely, in this very beautiful poetic language, kind of talks about the cycle of the seasons, and that the death of winter is natural and good and creates rebirth, and that there can't be one without the other, that there has to be this cyclical ebb and flow, and that is not something to fear, but something to really accept. And that is helpful to me personally. I'll set this out there for everyone to look at, and you can take it or leave it. But when I experience episodes of anxiety or depression, what's really helpful to me is knowing that my body is going through a cycle. My brain has these responses, and for me, they never get to a point where they might be dangerous. So that's really nice. But if I cannot be so worried about it and understand that these kind of cyclical moods happen, that can be really calming. And that's helpful for people who have this kind of like the seasons, as you're talking about, you know, people who are really affected by sunlight, and knowing that it's okay, and it'll pass, and it'll create something. You know, we talked about is Robert Lowell.
Robert Lowell, yeah, poet.
Talk about that.
Okay. Yeah, he was.
I think that's related to
one of our, most prolific and important American poets in the 20th century, and also one of the most public figures, and spent more time in institutions than Van Gogh, and didn't start treatment until later in his life. And there's a comment, about who knew that this might have been prevented. He was referring to manic episodes where he was literally raving around, claiming to be Alexander the Great and other historical figures before he was arrested and incarcerated and institutionalized, after having won Pulitzer Prizes, in Cambridge, in Massachusetts. But who knew that this could have been prevented because of a lack of salt in my brain? He was on lithium. And I don't mind sharing that, I have been on and off medication and in and out of treatment and care for the last 20 years of my life. And there have been times where the medication has had a numbing effect that was unpleasant. And I've been lucky to kind of be on, an edge of the spectrum where I can manage with certain self-care therapies. And we want to talk about that too. But I've noticed when I found the right balance of medication, it's like surfing and not falling off. It's like not being under the waves. And I'm not that great a surfer at all. So it's kind of like the handful of times I've surfed successfully. It's a pretty precarious, but it's helping me stay on top and be aware of these cycles. And that's, one of the things we were chatting about earlier before we started taping is that, there are statistics about these cycles, and May is Mental Health Month. Well, May is the month of the year where manic episodes and suicide spike. The spring is not a merry month for everyone. So anyway, I don't want to cut you off.
I know, and I'm not normal in that. I'm the opposite. I've always loved the winter. I get super hyped in the winter and the autumn months, and then I get sad in the spring and summer. But also too, I think it's important to know that when you are effectively medicated, whether it's through therapy or whether it's through actual medication, that then you can take those cycles and know how to manage yourself and know that, like, okay, right now I'm depressed, so I'm not going to be able to create a lot, and that's okay. I'll do something else that I can manage to do. Oh, I'm manic. I'm gonna make all the things and do all the stuff. Right. And that's what's important. There's like this misconception that you were maybe touching on, that once you're medicated, your creativity goes away. That's a really harmful and maybe too prevalent misconception that, like, oh, but Van Gogh, if he what we wouldn't have, what we have of his works, we wouldn't have Starry Night, or I can't think of any other ones.
It's all right.
If he was medicated, and that's a really harmful point of view to maybe have, because actually he was treated, first of all,
right,
and he did still paint while he was being treated, and maybe he was painting better when he was treated.
Well,
maybe he was able to manage it more.
Had he lived longer, had he been on medication, which could have prolonged his life, then who knows what his next period of creativity might have been. So it's, I'm glad you brought that up. And again, the book that we've been talking about, for those of you who might be interested in an incredible introduction to this topic of artists and creativity and mental illness, is by Kay Redfield Jameson. We'll post that. And as well as posting links to the concert that we discussed. But let's share some prompts, I think, some self-therapies,
Okay. Oh, you want me to start?
I can. It doesn't matter.
Well, I for almost a year now, I've been keeping a symptom tracker in my bullet journal. And my bullet journal is super extra in that I use it to I use it as a day planner, but I also make it really artistic. And I'm not really much of a visual artist. I'm not like very good at drawing, so
She's being modest.
I only share it with my mom. But but for me, as a musician, I don't always turn to music for comfort because that's my career, and that sounds weird to people sometimes. They're like, but that's your yeah, but that's my job, and sometimes I need a break from that, and so I do other things. But then I started doing the symptom tracker because my therapist recommended it. I very much need it because it takes these kind of ups and downs, and you can look at them almost from a third party point of view and see, because when you're experiencing it, it feels like this is how I've always felt, and I'll never feel any other different way again. This is just me now. But when you put it in perspective on a piece of paper, it really goes like this. And sometimes it's like this, and then sometimes it's like this, and it's all over the place. And you have that kind of what is in yogic philosophy, where the self is not the fluctuations and the mental projections. The self is separate, and you can look at a mirror, but if it's dirty, you're not seeing the reflection that's in the mirror, you're seeing the dirt. And if you can clear away the dirt, and that dirt is like whatever you want it to be, maybe it's all the stimulation that you receive and the feedback you receive and the thoughts that you have, in whether they're intrusive or whether they're just like chattering all day, those aren't who you are. There's things underneath that are who you are, and those things are you and what you value and what you care about, and you can clear the grime and see those things. So that's a thing I do.
That's
a
great exercise. What grime do you need to clear from the mirror today?
Yeah.
One of my favorite prompts along those lines, if you're kind of doing like a journaling prompt, and for those who journal, we obviously don't need to sell you on the therapeutic and creative value of it. If you don't do any journaling or creative writing, we recommend it. Another prompt could be, what one thing would you try if you knew you couldn't fail? It's a variation on the living vision kind of dream prompt, which really can help unlock creativity. What one thing would you try if you knew you couldn't fail? And put another way, if blank wasn't holding you back, what would you do? Or who would you be? And that reminds me of my first self-care therapy, besides, that didn't come from my mother. My mother was a psychologist and then a social worker, and really a therapist until I started seeing a professional one when I turned 30. So, and she was one of the ones who encouraged me, Scott, I think you need to talk to someone. So, but we talked about The Artist's Way, Julia Cameron, a book that's over 25 years old now, a very famous, but it's a kind of a guided course through journaling, through honoring your artistic creative self. And one of her exercises is to list, a handful of dream jobs that you might have wanted to be as a child, or that you might still want to be. And list them, and then to take a variation on our theme. What if you lived like that person? What if I lived like the astronaut I wanted to be? Well, I'd need to do some research and study, and then I'd also need to spend some time networking. Probably want to do a little exploring and some stargazing. It's a way to cultivate a hobby and a passion. So that's something you could try for a week at a time. You could do 4 of those. Another, if you want a creative prompt for the artists among us, or those wanting something really creative, we mentioned the 4 seasons and the 4 temperaments. So spring would correspond with the sanguine temperament, the healthy blood. This is a normal person. someone who's not on the neurodiversity spectrum, right? So spring and sanguine, then summer and choleric. Choleric, of course, cholera, hot-blooded, summer and mania, they correspond. So we're talking about the 4 seasons, a famous artistic theme, and corresponding it to 4 temperaments. The fall would correspond to the phlegmatic temperament. It's when we start to get colds. So the phlegmatic temperament, that makes sense, right? And then winter and melancholic. Of course, the time, and Asher so beautifully talked about winter in her discussion of Sure on the Shining Night. So that could be an exercise. Create in a medium not your favorite or familiar a cycle of 4 seasons, and let the 4 seasons interact with the 4 temperaments. You know, like draw that, paint that, dance that. If you've never written a song, try to write a song. If you've never written a poem, write a poem. Try to write something that looks like a piece of art. You know, that's a fun thing to do, to make visual art with words and to cross boundaries. And that's one of the reasons we're here, is we are artists that care about that kind of collaboration. And you know, you mentioned that you turn to other forms of creativity, which I do too. And then I'm also so happy to still find a regenerative, renewing power in the art that I loved first, which was music, you know, and putting this program together, which, as I said, you know, at the beginning, it features several centuries of music connecting mental health and creativity, and it's performed in the galleries of the Taubman Museum, thanks to them, and we hope you will check it out. We are so grateful to our generous patrons for making this happen, to all of our friends at the collective, Dr. Bob Tressman, such a pleasure to have you here. Also, thank you to Bonnie Hennig Tressman for hosting us and helping make this possible. Ashura, thank you. And
Scott,
Pedro,
thank you.
You're welcome. Pedro and Bill, who are in the performance video, thank you. And we hope to see you again soon.